The town of Welcroft had always admired its hill, though no one ever wanted to live atop it. Too much wind, they said. Too many stones in the soil, too much quiet in the night air. But when the council gifted the hilltop house to Dr. Elias Madden in the spring of 1887, no one objected. It felt right, they said. The doctor had served for nearly 30 years, birthed half the town's children, tended to fevers, and pulled bullets from soldiers who never learned to duck. The house itself had stood empty for years, a three-gabled Victorian with rusted gates and a winding staircase made of elderwood. Some believed it had once belonged to a family who died of scarlet fever. Others said it was never truly finished, just filled. Either way, the Maddens moved in under an overcast sky, their wagons quiet, their faces unreadable. Dr. Madden, his wife Genevieve, and no children, not yet. The first birth came in June. No one was invited, no one was needed. The doctor, after all, had delivered hundreds before. Word spread by the blacksmith's wife, who had seen bloodied linen soaking in a tin bucket by the back well. She thought it strange there was no wet nurse called. Stranger still was the silence. No infant cries drifted down the hill, no lullabies, no lull in the pattern of the doctor's walking stick tapping across his porch each night. He simply nodded when asked in town. A girl, he said, healthy, resting. The townsfolk believed him because they wanted to, because it was easier than pressing further. But it happened again in October, then again in January. By spring, the Maddens were said to have 4 daughters. But none were ever seen in the chapel, none listed in the school registry. There were no toys in the yard, no bibs hung to dry, no muddy footprints on the cobbled path. Only shutters drawn, curtains stiff with age, and the faint flicker of candlelight in the same nursery window each night. The grocer once asked if Genevieve needed more milk. She smiled, shook her head, and asked instead for vinegar, gauze, and lavender oil. He didn't ask again. Neighbors began calling it the house without sound. Even birds seemed to avoid it. Children were told not to point. Men kept their eyes low when riding past. But it wasn't fear that kept them away. It was confusion. The kind that itches at the back of the mind and never resolves. How could a home be filled with daughters and still feel so hollow? On Sundays, Genevieve walked to church alone. She wore white gloves even in winter. Her lips never moved during hymns. Her face held no sadness, no joy, and only vacancy. The pastor tried to visit once, holding a tin of bread pudding and the book of Psalms. She greeted him at the door and stood just inside, not inviting him in. He swore he heard a clock ticking behind her, though there was none on the wall. And something else, a faint scraping, like fingernails on wood. She insisted it was the wind. The local midwife, a widow named Alma Stead, tried to offer help. She left a basket of warming herbs and hand-stitched booties at the gate. They were returned the next day, folded neatly and wrapped in butcher's paper. No note. Just the smell of rubbing alcohol soaked deep into the cloth. Alma said she once passed the house at dusk and heard a baby's cough, short and sharp, like something startled into silence. But when she turned, there was no child. Only Genevieve, standing in the shadows of the veranda, her hands clasped so tightly her gloves tore at the seams. By the end of the year, the Maddens were said to have 6 daughters. Still no school visits. Still no christenings. Still no graves. There were no death notices, but also no signs of growth. No new dresses hung to dry. No extra place settings at the shop. No laughter from the trees. Just a hill, silent and brooding, with a house that seemed untouched by time. Inside that house, something was happening. Something measured, something deliberate. The town would not understand it yet. But they had already decided something was wrong. They just didn't have the language for what kind of wrong. Not yet. Not until someone would ask the most important question of all. Where were the daughters? By the winter of 1889, the Maddens had officially registered the births of 7 daughters with the Welcroft town clerk. Each time, the documents were neat and prompt, signed in Dr. Elias Madden's practiced hand and countersigned by Genevieve in her fine, curling script. The names were lovely and forgettable: Emmeline, Clara, Bethany, Ruth, Lydia, Miriam, and Esther. 7 lines on yellowing paper filed into a drawer no one checked twice. But not a single baptism was ever scheduled. No one ever held a Madden child. No godparents were named. No cakes were baked or candles lit in celebration. The parish, puzzled, inquired once. A short letter arrived in reply explaining that the family believed in private devotion and home blessings. It was phrased so politely that to question it further felt impolite. Inside the Madden home, the nursery window glowed from dusk until dawn with a dull amber light. Genevieve was often seen passing behind it, her outline slow, gliding, never hurried. Once the mailman claimed to see her hold a bundled infant to her chest. But others said it looked more like a doll, too still, too pale, too tightly wrapped to be warm. The mailman never brought it up again. One of the few outsiders allowed near the house was Alma Stead, the retired midwife who had once tried to befriend Genevieve. She had stopped visiting after the 3rd child was born, disturbed by the quiet. Years later, she would write a letter no one read until she died. In it, she confessed that during her last visit, she'd gone upstairs while Genevieve stepped out to steep tea. She had followed the sound of a soft bump, like something shifting behind the nursery wall. And then, unmistakably, she heard scratching. Not from mice or raccoons, slower, rhythmic. Fingernails dragging in a pattern. She placed her ear against the plaster and said her skin turned to ice. There was a faint whispering sound behind the wall, a kind of hiccuped breathing, like a child's lungs fighting to take air. Before she could move, the noise stopped, and then a knock came from the inside, 3 times. She backed away and nearly fell down the stairs. Genevieve was waiting at the bottom, holding a single teacup and smiling. After that, Alma never returned. She told no one. Not then. The Maddens went on registering daughters. The town clerk began to wonder privately how Genevieve's body showed no signs of wear. Her frame was slim, her posture perfect, her complexion unchanged. She did not walk with the heaviness of a mother who had borne 7 children. Yet no one dared ask. No one felt it was their place. The doctor was a respected man. The house was quiet. That should have been enough. But records have memories even when people forget. And the school mistress, Miss Hollins, began noting each year that the Madden girls were still absent from enrollment. She sent letters. They went unanswered. Eventually, she stopped trying. The census man came in 1890 and found the door shut. No answer, no sounds, no children. Just a note pinned to the gate in the doctor's precise handwriting. All accounted for. No assistance required. By spring, the parish gravekeeper, Mr. Lowell, whispered over a pint that he had never dug a Madden grave. No small plots, no tiny stones, no signs of loss or mourning. Only silence. He joked once that either the children were blessed or hidden. No one laughed. It was becoming clear that something didn't add up. 7 daughters. No laughter, no crying, no footprints. Only smooth wooden floors and shuttered glass. Only names written in ink, not spoken aloud. And still the scratching returned in Alma's memory. Long after she passed, her letter was found tucked in a hymnal, and no one knew what to do with it. Some said she had lost her mind. Others believed every word. But by then the nursery window had darkened for good. The Maddens claimed no more children. The house no longer flickered at night, but deep inside those walls something had been built and sealed, not just a room, Not just a secret, a method, a system. A silence so deep it learned to knock back. The nurse's name was Maribel Voss, and by the time she died in the Welcroft sanitarium, she no longer spoke in full sentences. Her mouth twitched around syllables like a child chewing words it didn't yet understand. She had served the Maddens for only 11 months, from the spring of 1888 to the winter that followed. And after her final day at the Hilltop house, she walked barefoot into the church at midnight, face streaked with soot, clutching a soiled pillowcase. Inside it was a cloth doll with no arms, no eyes, and a stitched line where the mouth should have been. She screamed only once before collapsing, and afterward she never formed another sentence that made sense. Until the diary surfaced. It was found wedged into the back of a wooden drawer in the sanitarium's storage loft, long after her death. Most pages were smeared, some torn, but what remained painted something far more disturbing than madness. It began with her arrival, how the Maddens had requested a live-in nurse to assist with their youngest daughter, whom they said was recovering from a rare lung condition. The child, Maribel wrote, was pale, silent, and perfectly still. She never cried, never blinked, never adjusted in her crib. At first, Maribel believed the child was in some form of coma. But one evening, as she leaned close to adjust the blanket, she saw the chest rise and fall with mechanical rhythm. Not breath, not life, but a controlled artificial movement, slow and precise, like the ticking of a metronome. In the second week, Maribel found a locked cabinet in the rear parlor. The key was left beneath a folded rag on the fourth stair, as if someone wanted her to find it. Inside the cabinet were small anatomical drawings, infants skinned and labeled with notes in Dr. Madden's crisp handwriting. Each diagram was accompanied by lists of materials: tempered glass, water-sealed pulp, cotton thread, surgical wax. One note was underlined 3 times. Remove emotion at root, preserve form, not function. In the diary's margins, Maribel had scribbled something over and over: they don't breathe, they echo. She described being called to assist in what she assumed was an emergency delivery, but no blood came, no afterbirth, no struggling infant. The girl was already on the table, eyes open, lips moving without sound. Elias Madden stood beside her, gloved and calm, with a scalpel already tracing the outline of the ribcage. Genevieve held the child's hand with both of hers, whispering something over and over that Maribel couldn't hear. The child's face was wet, not with tears, but with what the nurse described as lacquered sweat, as if her skin had been painted to mimic human texture. The doctor removed the lungs in one piece. They were pink, but hard, like wax cooled too fast. He placed them into a jar already labeled with the child's name, and from a nearby drawer he withdrew 2 perfect replicas, transparent, ribbed like blown glass, wrapped in cotton filament, as if they'd been spun in the same shape by a patient hand over many nights. These he inserted carefully into the chest cavity, stitching the flesh with silk thread so thin it nearly vanished under the skin. Later that night, Maribel attempted to flee, but she never made it past the nursery door. There, she wrote, were the cribs, each with a child, each identical, each expressionless, 7 in total. Their chests rose and fell in exact unison. One turned its head slightly as she approached, not naturally, not curiously, but as if cued. Its eyes were fogged over like the surface of cold marble, and when its lips parted, nothing came out but the faint crackle of breath over something that was never meant to speak. In the final pages, Maribel described her hands trembling too hard to pack her things. She left the house at dawn, taking only her diary and the doll. The last entry was short and smudged, as if the ink was wiped mid-sentence. It read, "The paper skinned tears so easily. He replaces it without blinking. I asked where the real ones are. Genevieve smiled and said, They were too loud. The rest of the page was blank. In the spring of 1901, a fire broke out in the rear wing of the Welcroft Medical Library. Most of the damage was contained to one records room, where loose boxes of unindexed manuscripts were kept, donations from local physicians, scribbled treatises never published, case studies no journal dared accept. Among the ashes, a half-burned folio was recovered by a young clerk who mistook it for a ledger. It was bound in untreated calfskin, the title pressed faintly into the surface without ink. Preservation method: a doctrine of early purity. Inside were 87 pages of handwritten theory, diagrams, and procedural instructions. The author was listed as Dr. Elias Madden. The manuscript did not describe healing. It did not describe protection. It detailed with clinical precision how to remove what the doctor called afflictive cognition from children before it took permanent root. He argued that emotions such as grief, rage, defiance, and despair were not learned but inherited, embedded in the body like dormant illnesses. He claimed that these infections could be arrested, not cured but halted, through what he described as an embalming adjacent process applied while the child was still alive. He called it passive purification. The method involved deep sedation followed by temporary organ isolation. The child's central nervous system was to be quieted, then cooled using a solution of copper tincture and formal resin. Once the core temperature dropped below a threshold he called the submission point, the subject was surgically silenced, vocal cords disconnected, ear canals packed with gauze and wax to prevent external noise from disrupting the suspended state. The most disturbing element, however, came in the chapter titled Containment of the Will. Here, Madden described a technique of neurosealing, injecting a wax-like compound directly into the hippocampus to prevent the brain from forming what he called harmful associative memory. In simpler terms, he found a way to make a child forget pain before they could define it. The diagrams showed infant skulls drawn in cross-section, with lines indicating where to insert the sealing needle and how deep to push before resistance gave way. The notes were not speculative. They read as refined procedure, time-stamped, iterated, and perfected over years. Madden insisted that no child had ever suffered under his method because suffering, he argued, was a function of unregulated memory. By preventing memory, he believed he had elevated the child beyond harm. He called them preserved vessels, spared from the burden of emotional decay. Genevieve Madden's handwriting appeared in the margins, soft and slanted, suggesting corrections. She noted when the solution needed to be thinned, when the subject was too old to seal completely, when the chamber temperature required adjusting for smoother transitions. One line simply read, "Ruth's reaction slowed at 42 minutes. Consider earlier incision. Her presence in the process was not passive. She was co-architect." Where Elias approached the procedure as a scientist, Genevieve handled the outcomes, dressing the children, calming them before sedation, stitching lace into the blankets that lined the preparation table. The manuscript did not speak of love. It spoke only of silence. What stunned even modern forensic analysts, when the document was brought forward decades later, was how effective the preservation seemed to be. The notes referenced children remaining in a neutral state for months, some longer, maintained in low-light conditions with minimal movement and no verbal contact. They were fed through surgical tubes cleaned with antiseptic cloths, rotated hourly to prevent tissue pressure. There were no names used in the main text, only numbers, only initials, only procedural results. But in one appendix, 15 names were listed. All female, all matching the birth records filed in Welcroft Town Hall. The final pages offered a chilling justification. Dr. Madden argued that civilization was collapsing under the weight of children grown unstable. that to raise a child with full emotional autonomy was to invite collapse. He saw his work not as cruelty but as correction. He ended with a single phrase, underlined twice in red ink. They will never cry, never disobey, never suffer. They will never fall. They will remain pure. The fire that nearly destroyed the manuscript had burned through the last line, but the heat hadn't touched the names. The house on Benevolent Hill had sat mostly untouched for nearly a decade by 1904. Elias and Genevieve Madden had vanished from town records 3 years prior, neither death nor departure documented. The estate stood in probate limbo, its ownership unclear, its windows shut tight behind rotted drapes. When the property was finally sold to an out-of-town investor, the house was deemed structurally unstable. A small construction crew from the county was hired to assess the flooring, starting with the upper bedrooms. The youngest worker, Thomas Beck, was assigned to the nursery. He had no history with the house, no stories in his head. When his boot cracked through the warped pine near the rocking chair and sent him falling through to the darkness below, he thought he had just discovered a forgotten cellar. He was wrong. The space below wasn't built like any basement. The walls were rounded, sealed with stone mortar from top to bottom, lined with thin shelves and recesses that held no tools or wine or coal. What Thomas landed on wasn't earth or concrete. It was wood, a platform of some kind, hollow beneath, raised with steps leading to it on all 4 sides. But what stunned him first was the silence, not the kind that comes from absence, but the kind that feels designed. Like sound had been pushed out of the room entirely, locked away. The light from the broken floor above cast a weak glow, just enough to show shapes. Seats, small ones, arranged in neat arcs. He counted 9 at first, then saw more tucked into the corners. Each was no taller than a child's knees. Infant-sized chairs, perfectly symmetrical, carved from the same pale oak as the nursery floor above, and each one bore a name etched into the wood. Emmeline, Clara, Bethany, Ruth, Lydia, Miriam, Esther, and others. Some spelled wrong, some scratched in over older names. None repeated, none blank. Beneath each chair sat a single glass jar, sealed with wax, resting in a shallow circular groove cut into the floor. The jars were identical in size and shape, but not content. Inside, curled like worms in syrup, were small pink tissues, folded cords, darkening at the tips, vocal cords, preserved, dozens of them, each labeled with initials and dates. Some jars held 1 set, others held 2. One held 4, all tangled together, bound by a single ribbon that had long since turned brittle. Thomas screamed when he understood what he was looking at. But the room did not echo. His voice was swallowed whole. He scrambled out with the help of another worker who had run to the noise, but by then something had already changed in his expression. His eyes wouldn't fix on one place. His breath came short and shallow. When the sheriff arrived, the chamber had already been closed off with planks, the workers refusing to go back in. Only Thomas had seen the room in its undisturbed state, and he would not speak again. Not in full sentences, not with steady hands. He was sent home and later disappeared without resignation or goodbye. His mother found a small wooden chair hidden beneath his bed weeks later, half-built, nails unfinished, sanded smooth. The authorities who examined the chamber recorded it as a ceremonial room. A private place of mourning, they called it. That was the polite language used in the report. But the forensic pathologist brought in from the city scribbled a different note into his own copy. He wrote, "These were not memorials. These were instruments. This was an audience, a choir without throats." What disturbed him most was the spacing of the chairs, arranged in a tight semicircle facing a single wooden stand at the far end, where a tall stool was placed above a copper grate. The stool's seat had small handprints scorched into the varnish, as though someone had pressed down with great effort, and heat had followed. Beneath the grate were ashes and the remains of thread. The smell lingered for days after the room was opened. It was not the smell of time or decay. It was the smell of something once alive being kept quiet by design. The congregation of St. Wren's had never seen Father Mallory cry. Not in 40 years of funerals, baptisms, and slow Sunday sermons delivered in the same calm, unwavering tone. But on the morning of his final sermon, he stood at the pulpit with red-rimmed eyes and hands that trembled when he opened the old ledger he had carried to the altar. No one knew what was coming, though some whispered afterward that the air had changed the moment he walked in, that the bells sounded different that day, more hollow somehow, like they were warning instead of calling. What followed wasn't scripture, it was confession, not of his own sins, but of what he had allowed to pass in silence. He spoke of the Maddens by name, something no one had dared do in public since their disappearance. He said they brought him infants over the course of many years, bundled in white, wrapped tightly in cloth, their faces pale and their bodies stiff. He said Genevieve always looked tired but calm, her gloves clean, her voice soft. Elias rarely came inside. He waited in the carriage, watching the chapel door. Genevieve told the priest each time that the child had been stillborn. There had been complications, she said. There had been no breath, and there had been no need to involve the town doctor or arrange a viewing. The Maddens wanted peace. They wanted the child's name blessed and the paperwork completed. Quietly. At first, Father Mallory hesitated. He had never signed a burial certificate without seeing the body lowered into the ground. But the Maddens were respected. Elias had served the poor for years, had delivered babies others had written off. Genevieve's family had funded the chapel's renovations. And when the first request came, there had been something convincing in her face. Not grief, not sorrow, but resolve. The kind that made him believe she had already grieved long before walking through his door. He signed the first certificate without asking to see the burial. And then another, and another. Always girls, always newborns, always the same pattern. The names changed, but the process didn't. A white bundle, a brief prayer, a small donation for the poor box, and then she would be gone. It never felt right, but it never felt fully wrong either. Not until he asked one afternoon if he could hold the child and say a proper blessing. Genevieve said no, so gently that it didn't sound like refusal. She said the child was fragile. He believed her, until he glanced at the cloth and noticed the stitching. Not along the seams of the blanket, but around the edge of the infant's jaw. Not thread, but something thinner, wire. He blinked, and when he looked again, she was already closing the fabric tighter. He buried that moment with the others. But over the years, they stacked up, too many to ignore. 21 certificates, 21 girls, not one burial performed. He asked once if the family preferred cremation. Genevieve said they had already made arrangements on the property. The priest assumed she meant the small graveyard behind the house. But when he visited after their disappearance, that cemetery had no stones, no markers, no disturbed earth. Just grass, tall, wild, unbroken grass. What he read from the pulpit that morning was a list of names, each child, each certificate, each lie. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't seek understanding. He said he had been a coward, a tool for something he didn't recognize until it was too late. And then he opened the ledger one final time and revealed what he called the Maddens' request, a passage written by Elias himself, quoted in a note given with the very first infant. It read, "Stillborns do not suffer. Stillborns do not weep. They are pure in their quiet. Do not rouse what was meant to remain preserved." The next day, the bishop declared Father Mallory unfit and removed him from the parish. But the town never forgot the list. It was read aloud again at the courthouse weeks later. But no graves were ever found, no bodies exhumed. Only names and the knowledge that each signature had sealed silence where questions should have lived. The false hearth was discovered by accident, long after the Maddens were gone. A preservation historian touring the estate noticed irregular brickwork behind the nursery's cold fireplace. The mortar had dried differently, uneven, brittle, where the rest had hardened with time. Behind it was a hollow space no wider than a bookshelf. Inside, wrapped in muslin and tied with velvet cord, were 9 thin parchment journals. Their covers were soft and pliable, made not of leather but something else. Smooth, porous, pale, human skin. Each was labeled not by title but by a season and a number. Winter 2, Spring 5, Autumn 3. The handwriting inside was unmistakable, slanted and clean. It belonged to Genevieve Madden. The journals began like diaries filled with quiet observations on routine, feeding schedules, lullaby rotations, notes about humidity, light exposure, and the necessary temperature to maintain placid readiness. But the tone shifted quickly, moving from maternal reflection to procedural documentation. She referred to the children not as daughters, but as vessels. She described the goal not as raising them, but as perfecting them. In one entry she wrote, "Obedience is not taught, it is etched." That became her doctrine. She outlined what she called quieting measures, beginning with the early removal of what she believed to be the anatomical source of disobedience. Small glands located near the throat and jawline, which she claimed produced the tension that leads to weeping. The procedure was performed with a fine surgical hook, inserted under the tongue while the child was sedated. She made note of how much quicker the quiet came after the 3rd operation. The earlier, the better. Before fear could take shape, before the will could rise. The journals included recipes for tonics that froze muscle movement temporarily. She called these hollowing drafts, made from crushed seeds, lye-soaked milk, and a bitter root grown in the family garden. The children were given the tonic daily until their limbs moved only when guided. Genevieve described this stage as the still bloom and wrote that it was her favorite. They stopped resisting clothing changes. Their eyes no longer flinched at light. One child, she said, stayed in the same curled position for 5 days, perfectly content. She marked it as a success. In the margins, Elias Madden added notes in smaller print confirming that heartbeat and temperature remained stable. He referred to the condition as neural dormancy. The most disturbing entries detailed the obedience rituals. These were done not in punishment but in ceremony. Genevieve called them lessons in grace. Each child was marked with shallow cuts at the base of the spine, a series of lines meant to mirror the curvature of angel wings. These incisions were not deep enough to scar fully, but enough to ache when moved. The children were taught to associate pain with disobedience, not through scolding, but through pressure. If one turned its head during feeding, Genevieve would place a warm iron nail on the floor beside them, not touching, just near, until the child stilled. If another blinked too often, she covered its eyes in muslin soaked with lavender and vinegar and whispered until the lashes stopped fluttering. One passage read, "They begin to understand that movement is unnecessary. The world will come to them in stillness, and only in stillness will they be loved." The journals also revealed an ongoing struggle to maintain appearances. Genevieve noted when visitors approached, when to darken the nursery window, and how long each child could remain sitting upright before the posture weakened. Elias constructed a back brace out of copper and lace for one girl who slumped too often. He adjusted the tension each week, noting in his corrections, "Rigidity is a kindness when purpose outweighs comfort." None of the entries described guilt. None questioned the practice. Genevieve believed her children were being spared the suffering of the outside world. They would never hear cruelty, never scream, never be bent by pain or twisted by longing. They would remain whole by being kept still. She ended one journal with a single line, pressed harder than the rest, the ink bleeding through the page. "Let the world teach rage. I will teach them quiet." He was 15 when he first mentioned it, the deaf boy from the farm across the pasture. His name was Samuel Dorr, and though he'd lost his hearing after a bout of scarlet fever as a child, he'd developed a strange sensitivity to vibration. He described it to his teacher like a kind of humming beneath his feet, a soft rhythm he could feel in his bones, mostly unnoticed unless it was regular. That was what made the bell stand out. Every Sunday, just before noon, he would walk along the edge of the pasture, keeping pace with the boundary fence that lined the base of Benevolent Hill. And every Sunday at exactly 12, he would stop, turn toward the Madden house, and place both hands on the ground. He said it came like a heartbeat slowed to match the earth. 12 times. Always 12. Always from beneath. People dismissed it, thinking it a misunderstanding, a child's way of inventing sound through sensation. But when the house was excavated in 1912 by a team sent from the State Historical Bureau, they uncovered something that made his story impossible to ignore. Beneath the original foundation, down a narrow crawl space hidden behind the fireplace flue, was a sealed room constructed entirely of stone and packed with salt-dried earth. Inside stood a single iron bell, bolted into a wooden beam dark with time and rot. It wasn't large, perhaps no bigger than a dinner plate, but its design was unlike anything local craftsmen had ever produced. The outer shell was engraved with spirals that tightened inward, and the clapper was wrapped not in cloth but in sinew, still wet and dark like it had refused to decay. Attached to the bell's lever was a thin mechanism made of brass and carved bone. It connected to a long, tendon-wrapped rod that extended up through a slit in the ceiling, disappearing into the wood above. When they followed it, they found the rod ended in a small, gloved hand. Severed at the shoulder, bone fused with brass, the tendons still curled around the lever grip. The arm belonged to a child no older than a year. Its skin was waxed, its fingers positioned to tighten when pulled. The forensic examination couldn't explain how the arm had been preserved so thoroughly. The tissue was soft, the muscle intact. The doctor noted that the cartilage at the wrist had been reinforced with resin, making it flex only in one direction. When the lever was tested, the hand drew back slowly and released the bell once with a muted chime. They pulled again. It rang once more. Always a delay between each ring, always a pause long enough to unsettle. Someone had designed it to be rung manually, at regular intervals, with no need for sound to echo back. The vibration, they said, would carry through the floorboards, just enough for the room above to feel it. And they found that room, a circular chamber directly over the bell housing, padded with woven hair and lined with child-sized seating. The space was covered in chalk symbols and one sentence repeated in charcoal along the stone. "Stillness is not silence unless the bell agrees." No one could say what the bell meant, whether it was a signal, a ceremony, or simply a way to count. But records show that the clock tower in Welcroft had been repaired multiple times between 1889 and 1902, each time due to unexplained mechanical disruption, always on Sundays, always near noon. Some began to wonder if the Maddens weren't just measuring time, but interrupting it. And when the bell was finally removed from the house, it rang 12 times as they carried it down the hill, even though no one touched the lever. The preserved hand had stiffened, the tendons locked. But the sound kept coming, 12 slow chimes, and then nothing. The cellar beneath the Madden house had been searched before, or so the town believed. When the property changed hands and was briefly opened for appraisal, Officials claimed they found nothing but spoiled preserves and mold. But in 1951, during a quiet historical survey, a volunteer named Edith Travers removed a shelving unit warped by moisture and revealed a wall that hadn't been seen since the Maddens vanished. It was stone, old and cracked, but near its center was a carving. Not initials, not dates, a tree, a family tree. Thin lines etched deep with branches splitting out from two names, Elias and Genevieve. Beneath them, 13 offshoots, each ending in a girl's name. 12 were clear: Emmeline, Clara, Bethany, Ruth, Lydia, Miriam, Esther, Annalisa, Florence, June, Cecily, Helen. But the 13th name was different. It had been carved deeply, angrily, then violently scratched out with something sharp. The stone was scarred where the letters had been, and traces of iron were embedded in the groove. Someone had tried to erase it, not hide it. Like punishment. Like a scar made visible on purpose, the discovery was photographed, documented, then mostly forgotten, until 1966, when 3 letters arrived at the Welcroft Historical Society. They were unsigned, written in a childlike hand, but postmarked from various towns across the state. The content was chilling. The first began with a line no one could explain. I sat in the 13th cradle but never stayed still. The letter described a room no one had ever seen on record. A chamber lined with mirrors, not to reflect but to distort. The child claimed she had been placed there as punishment for noise. Each mirror showed a version of herself that moved slower than real time. She wrote that she had learned to hold her breath until the reflections matched her again, and that only then was she allowed to leave. The second letter described what she called the backward bed, where her head was strapped in reverse to a harness so that any motion created disorientation. She said Genevieve believed dizziness helped the body forget its wants. The girl was fed upside down, wrapped in cold cloth, and taught to repeat a single phrase through clenched teeth until the words lost meaning. The phrase, scrawled again and again in the letter's margins, was, "I will not carry sound." The final letter was the most disturbing. It contained no description, only a diagram. It showed the family tree carved in the cellar wall with all names accounted for, including the one missing, Naomi. The name was drawn in thick pencil where the scratch marks had been. Next to it was a sentence written in trembling script. She heard too much. She remembered too much. She left too much behind. Investigators tried to trace the source of the letters, but no fingerprints were found. The paper was common, the ink factory made, and the envelopes all bore stamps from different post offices. But one thing stood out. The return address was blank on all 3 except for a single drawing in the lower left corner. A cradle split down the middle with one side burned black. People speculated. Some said it was a hoax. Others believed Naomi was real, that she had escaped whatever system the Maddens built and spent the rest of her life trying to understand what had been done to her. In the years that followed, 2 more letters were found tucked into library books about child development, each with no signature. One read, "They silenced 12. They failed on 1. That's why the bells stopped." The other was shorter. "I wasn't supposed to open my eyes, but I did. And I saw the shelf where they kept the voices." The 13th cradle was never found. No physical record of it existed beyond the scratched-out name. But every room in the house was eventually examined, and in the attic they found an iron frame, small and bent, with one side detached. It was half the size of the others in the nursery, pushed into the corner behind broken trunks. No mattress, just straps. And underneath it, folded into a crack in the floorboard, was a strip of parchment. On it, one line was written in fading ink, "You cannot preserve what learns to remember." It was meant to be a routine renovation. The western wing of St. Wren's Chapel had suffered water damage after years of frost and neglect. Volunteers stripped the plaster and began repairing the stone underneath, But behind one of the inner walls, not quite in the nave, not quite in the vestry, they discovered a narrow cavity sealed by mismatched bricks. A mason, curious about the uneven mortar, chipped through, expecting to find a gap in the foundation. Instead, he found a frame, heavy, wrapped in linen that had darkened to the color of dried blood. When the cloth was peeled away, the workers fell silent. The chapel emptied. The bishop demanded it be covered until the proper authorities arrived. The painting measured nearly 5 feet across. Its style was unmistakably 19th century, formal and posed. A seated man with thinning hair and a surgeon's posture, one hand resting on a leather-bound book. A woman beside him, her spine straight, hands clasped in her lap. Behind them, 12 children stood in 2 perfect rows. Girls. Ages ranging from infant to perhaps 10, all wearing cream-colored dresses with matching cuffs. And yet not a single one had eyes. Each girl's sockets had been sewn shut, not painted that way, but stitched, actual thread pierced, the canvas pulled tight in black X's across each child's face. At first it was assumed to be an artistic decision, symbolic or grotesque, but when the threads were tested, they were found to be organic. Hair, human hair, pulled through the canvas with a hooked needle tied off behind the frame. Not all the strands matched. Experts confirmed they came from at least 5 different children, none older than 6. The canvas bore no signature, no date. But it was clearly painted in the Madden house. The furnishings in the background matched those documented in old property ledgers. The same velvet drapes that once hung in the drawing room. The same grandfather clock that had gone missing from probate inventory. Elias Madden's likeness was unmistakable. The expression he wore was neither warm nor cold, simply composed. Genevieve's face was blank, her lips slightly parted as if waiting for someone else to speak. But it was the arrangement of the girls that drew the most attention. They weren't smiling. They weren't rigid. They simply existed, captured in place like pressed flowers beneath glass. Each held their arms stiffly at their sides. Each wore a name tag sewn into the dress collar. Too faint to read in the painting, but revealed through magnification and ultraviolet light. The names matched birth records found in Welcroft archives. 11 of them. The 12th girl's tag had been painted over in thick strokes of gray. She was also the only child who stood slightly off-center, her posture uneven, one shoulder turned away as if she had shifted at the last moment. It broke the symmetry. It disrupted the control. Behind the canvas, tucked into the hollow where the frame had rested, investigators found a folded note written in old ink, its language cold and clinical. It read, "The removal of sight grants clarity. These vessels do not require witness, only placement. Their purpose is containment, not reflection. Do not correct the 12th. She failed to settle. No one could determine who had written it, though some suspected Genevieve. The handwriting resembled hers, and the language mirrored her phrasing from the journals found years prior. It was the phrase "failed to settle" that chilled the room most. It suggested intent. It confirmed hierarchy. It implied that among the preserved one had broken form. The portrait was removed from church custody and placed in state evidence, though many believed it should have been destroyed. It was never displayed publicly, not after what the conservators found behind the canvas. Not paint, but tissue. Embedded into the linen near the edges were small flakes of skin, fragments of flesh pressed flat, preserved by pressure and oil. DNA analysis decades later confirmed the tissue came from 3 individuals, all female, all under the age of 7. The canvas hadn't simply captured the children. It had contained them, in form, in fiber, in permanence. The Maddens hadn't painted a memory. They had stitched silence into history. And no one could say how long it had hung there, sealed behind the wall of a church, watching no one through sewn eyes. On the morning of October 17th, 1910, the Madden house stood exactly as it always had. Shutters drawn, chimney cold, the gate hanging half open on one rusted hinge. But something in the air felt off. The mail was untouched. No smoke rose from the flue. No footprints marked the gravel path despite the rainfall the night before. The grocer noticed first when the weekly order went unclaimed, then the pastor, when no tithe arrived with Genevieve's delicate script. By nightfall, whispers reached the sheriff, who walked up the hill with 2 deputies and a copy of the civil code in his pocket, prepared to issue a welfare check. He would not speak of what he found. He would only write it down. The door was unlocked. Nothing had been broken, no sign of struggle. The dining table was set with 12 small bowls and 2 larger ones, each filled with dried grain and bone broth, untouched, congealed at the edges. The fireplace was empty but warm. Upstairs, the nursery door was open for the first time in years. Inside, the cribs were arranged in a half circle. 13 total. The linens were clean, the air still, and yet something about the space felt crowded. The deputies refused to enter. One vomited before reaching the 2nd floor. The other turned and left the house entirely. Only the sheriff made it through the entire property, floor by floor, room by room. When he returned to his office, he wrote a single sentence into the police entry log before sealing the record. The walls hum. The cribs are full. No bodies were recovered. No signs of departure. The Maddens were simply gone. Genevieve's jewelry remained in her locked drawer. Elias's medical bag still sat on the stool beside the bed. Every chair was pushed in, every light extinguished. The cellar was locked from the inside. A mirror near the nursery had been cracked, clean, precise, like a single point of pressure had broken it without force. Beneath the glass, etched into the wooden dresser, someone had carved a single word: preserved. Within a week, the town held a private meeting and voted to seal the house under religious order. They boarded the windows, nailed the doors shut, and wrapped the gates in iron chain. No blessing was spoken. No search was organized. No vigil was held. The Maddens were not mourned. They were contained. Their names were not removed from the town records, but marked in red ink with a single note beside each: unresolved. Over time, the soil around the foundation hardened and weeds grew in unnatural patterns along the path. Dogs would not cross the fence. Children dared each other to touch the gate, but none lingered. And in the winter months, when the wind turned sharp, some claimed to hear faint noises from within the walls. Not cries, not voices, just humming, faint and rhythmic, like breath that had never learned to stop. In 1943, renovations began on the lower levels of Greybriar Asylum, a psychiatric hospital 40 miles north of Welcroft. The hospital had long outgrown its crumbling foundations, and contractors were ordered to clear unused corridors for patient expansion. One such hallway, sealed behind a rusted door marked simply with the letter P, had not been entered since the building's original construction. Records listed it as a preservation wing, though no one could say what had been preserved there or why it had been sealed in 1902. When the lock was cut and the door opened, the stench of alcohol and something older spilled into the corridor like a long-held breath finally exhaled. Inside were rows of glass tanks, each standing shoulder height, filled with thick amber liquid. There were no lights, no labels at first glance, only outlines. But when the nearest tank was wiped clean, the shape within came into focus. An infant, floating upright, head tilted slightly, skin nearly translucent. Its eyes were closed, its limbs stiff but unmarked, its chest sunk inward like the lungs had been carefully emptied and sealed. At the base of the tank, etched into a brass plate, were the words: Madden. 5th. They catalogued 11 tanks before stopping. Each one held a preserved child frozen in an identical state of artificial peace. None appeared to be more than a year old. The mouths were stitched shut with thread that, under the microscope, revealed itself to be braided hair, identical in pattern, harvested from multiple sources. The fingertips were raw beneath the fluid, as if the skin had been scrubbed clean of prints before suspension. Internal scans showed organs still intact but chemically neutralized. The hearts were shriveled, the spines slightly bent, as if the children had been taught to bow before being locked in time. One doctor, a newly appointed forensic consultant, began taking detailed notes. He referred to the bodies as specimens at first, but after opening the third tank and exposing the face to air, he changed his wording to subjects. The skin did not break, the expression did not shift. But as he wrote later in the logbook, something about the posture suggested the child had known it would be watched forever. He attempted to document every detail, preservation method, condition, abnormal features, but his entries grew shorter, more erratic. His final note ended mid-sentence. Specimen 5 shows no evidence of decay, though minor tissue warping near the earlobe suggests either early-stage ossification or... The pen stopped. The page went blank. He was never seen at the facility again. Greybriar Asylum was closed 2 years later for financial reasons. But among the boxes left behind during the final sweep, one file remained marked with a red wax seal, and a word scratched into the cover so deeply it tore through the backing. Stillborns. Inside were photographs of each tank, each infant, each brass plate. And in one photo, taken from the far corner of the room, there appeared to be a 12th tank partially obscured by shadow. Its plate was different, not engraved but scrawled in black ink. She moved once. In 1949, following a string of anonymous reports, leaked hospital photos, and reopened files stamped with the name Madden, the federal inquiry finally reached its threshold. What had once been considered folklore, an eccentric couple, whispers of silence, unbaptized daughters, was now evidence threaded through autopsy logs, sealed psychiatric archives, and bone-white jars labeled with initials no one had claimed. There were no formal convictions, no living witnesses, no clear trail. But what remained could no longer be ignored. One by one, states began introducing emergency motions to prevent the quiet repetition of what had happened in Welcroft. By autumn, the Federal Burial Registry Act passed with near unanimous support. The law was simple in language but heavy in intent. No child under the age of 1 could be declared deceased without the presence of a certified third-party observer. All infant autopsies were to be performed under documented supervision. All stillbirths required physical burial, witnessed and registered, with grave location recorded and reviewed by a certified registry. Solitary death reporting for children under 1 year was banned. Midwives were no longer permitted to file death notices without a medical examiner present. The act did not name the Maddens, but the whispers in every hallway of every building where the law was read said otherwise. Welcroft responded differently. They didn't hold hearings. They didn't hold vigils. They built a memorial, not at the church or the cemetery, but at the base of Benevolent Hill, on the outer edge of the overgrown path that led to the ruined house. It was not marked by names, just 13 stone cradles carved from the same kind of marble used for gravestones, set in a crescent around a patch of flattened grass where nothing had grown since the house was sealed. No plaque, no dates, no sermon. Only a wooden sign at the edge of the road that read, "For the ones not counted." Every year, someone would leave a white ribbon tied to the center cradle. No one ever saw who. By then, the Madden name had become untouchable, omitted from town records, unspoken in classrooms, but the legacy of what they did remained like a stain in the architecture. The wind on the hill sounded wrong. Doors at the old post office stuck every Sunday at noon, even after being replaced, and families who moved into the nearby homes never stayed long. They said the echo was faint, but always there. Not voices, not crying, just a hum, a low vibration from somewhere beneath the soil, always felt more than heard, like something buried had never quite gone still. The act remained federal law. Burial oversight became standard. But none of it could answer the question no one dared put into words. If silence could be written into law, what else had been written into the children? What memory? What method? What remained preserved, not in jars or stone, but in ritual? And what if those rituals didn't end with the Maddens? What if they had simply changed hands? The memorial still stands, but those who pass it at noon on Sundays rarely stop. They say it's better to keep walking, because if you pause too long, you might feel the 13th cradle shift. There were no trials, no exhumations, no confessions. The Maddens disappeared before any questions could be asked, and what they left behind was not a scene of violence, but of absence. No blood, no screams, only the outline of suffering carved into wood, stitched into cloth, sealed in glass. The town did not forget, but forgetting would have been easier than what Welcroft chose instead. To remember without speaking, to mourn without naming, to pass down warnings wrapped in silence. Evil had not come to their hill in the shape of a monster. It came dressed in white gloves, a doctor's coat, a lullaby hummed through locked doors. It came with steady hands and handwritten ledgers, with stitched mouths and sterilized tools. It came as care, measured, clinical, undeniably calm. Those who studied the case later called it a tragedy of concealment, an institutional failure to act. But that language was too soft, too modern. It didn't explain how neighbors turned their eyes away after the second child or the third. It didn't explain how the priest kept signing certificates for infants he never buried, how a town sealed a house with children still inside and called it closure. The truth was simpler and darker. Evil that whispers is easier to ignore than evil that shouts. And when it wears the face of someone educated, someone respected, someone who calls it mercy, it doesn't feel like horror. It feels like policy. The Maddens were never found, no bones uncovered, no trail followed. But their work survived them, in the sealed wings of hospitals, in redacted reports, in laws written decades too late. And still today, no one has ever confirmed how many children passed through that house, how many were silenced, how many never learned what it meant to cry. All that's left are the cradles. Cold stone, arranged in a half moon at the base of the hill. Names carved shallow, letters fading, but the ground beneath them never settled. And every so often a wind moves through that doesn't match the season. We look for evil in rage, in noise, in chaos, but sometimes evil lives in stillness, in control, in hands that never shake. What do you think? Could it happen again? If it whispered instead of shouted? If it wore a smile? If the silence felt safe? Would we even notice, or would we write it off again as care?